Commander Kell's ship broke through Earth's cloud cover with the smooth precision the Kesek fleet was known for. From orbit, the human planet looked almost serene: blue oceans, green continents, and swirling clouds. Peaceful, deceptively peaceful. Kell had been briefed on humanity. They were a relatively young species, aggressive by nature, yet capable of forming complex societies and wielding surprisingly advanced technology. He had expected their military installations to reflect some version of that: clean, orderly, strategic. What he wasn't prepared for, what no data file or intelligence report could possibly convey, was the chaos that greeted him at West Point. Rain pounded the shuttle's hull as it touched down on a landing pad near the Academy ground. Kell descended the ramp, his translator buzzing softly in his ear as it adjusted to the torrent of sound surrounding him. It wasn't gunfire or the thrum of engines. No, it was shouting. Hundreds of voices, instructors barking commands, cadets shouting responses, the thunder of boots in mud. The air smelled of wet earth, sweat, and iron. "Humans do what for fun?" Kell muttered aloud, more to himself than to anyone else. His aide, Lieutenant Varick, stepped hesitantly beside him, his antennae twitching in discomfort beneath the gray sky. The young officer had never seen anything like this. Neither had Kell. Before them, rows of human cadets marched through knee-deep mud, their uniforms soaked, faces streaked with rain, grit, and determination. Instructors, most larger and more vocal than Kell could have imagined, paced the lines, barking instructions with a fervor that bordered on manic. To Keswick eyes, it looked like a punishment ritual. Kell crossed his arms, his mandibles tightening slightly in thought. Normal? This isn't training. It's torture. Their species trained in simulation chambers, where precise conditions could be replicated. Battlefields were reconstructed with pinpoint accuracy, and physical discomfort was minimized so intellect and decision-making could shine. Training, after all, was about preparation, not suffering. At least, that was the Kesek way. Kell had envisioned this diplomatic tour as an exchange of military philosophies. He expected briefings on strategy, glimpses of technological advances, perhaps shared war games in a controlled environment. What he got, instead, was mud, noise, and a sense of primal struggle he hadn't felt since the early campaigns of his own career. A figure approached through the storm, his uniform soaked, boots caked with grime. Yet his stride was confident, and his smile wide, far too cheerful for the weather. "Commander Kell," the man called, extending a hand. Kell hesitated for a moment before accepting the gesture. The handshake was firm, warm, strangely reassuring. "Major Harlow," the man introduced himself. "I'll be your guide today. Welcome to West Point." "Your academy," Kell began cautiously, "appears unconventional." Harlow laughed, the sound oddly musical, echoing over the thunder and distant shouting. "This," he gestured to the chaos around them, "this is just Field Week. Builds character." "Character?" Kell repeated, glancing at Varick, whose face had gone slightly pale under his naturally bluish skin. "Absolutely," Harlow continued, undeterred. "It's all about teaching these young men and women how to function when everything's going wrong. Rain, mood, exhaustion, confusion, that's where leadership's born." Kell turned his gaze back to the cadets. One had just tripped in the mud, falling face first. Without pause, the cadet pushed himself up, spat out a mouthful of dirt, and kept crawling. "They seem to embrace it," Varick whispered. "That's the point," Harlow said, nodding. "You can't teach grit in a classroom. You have to live it." To Kell, it felt like madness. The Kesek valued precision, clarity of thought. Their cadets studied tactics, diplomacy, and war simulations. Physical conditioning existed, of course, but not like this. Not in mud pits and storms, surrounded by shouting and raw chaos. He couldn't help but see it as inefficient. Why introduce unnecessary hardship? Why expose one's soldiers to such relentless discomfort? But there was something more than just physical strain in these humans, something unsettling. He could see it in their eyes. A kind of spark, a fire. Even as their bodies strained, their expressions remained locked in fierce focus. Some were even smiling. They were thriving. Kel couldn't make sense of it. On a battlefield, perhaps such desperation was expected. But here, in training, by design? What do your people believe hardship is for? Harlow asked suddenly, his tone shifting. The question caught Kel off guard. Hardship is to be avoided, managed, minimized. It clouds judgment and disrupts optimal performance. The major nodded slowly. That's one way to look at it. But we believe hardship reveals truth about who you are, what you're made of. It's not the obstacle, it's the forge. Kel blinked. The forge. The word conjured images of fire and hammer, of metal being reshaped under pressure. A crude analogy, yet disturbingly accurate. Come on, Harlow said, clapping his hands together. There's plenty more to see. As they moved deeper into the academy grounds, the rain continued to fall in steady sheets. The buildings were practical gray, weather-worn, and unadorned. The kind of place built not for comfort, but for enduring the elements. They passed another field where cadets were performing push-ups in the mud. One instructor walking among them with what appeared to be a loudspeaker and a bucket of freezing water. Every time a cadet faltered, they were doused. They willingly endure this? Kel asked. Willingly might be a stretch, Harlow said with a grin, but they know it serves a purpose. We break them down here so the enemy doesn't do it out there. The idea was almost offensive to the Kizek mindset. Why would a military dismantle its own recruits? The entire purpose of training, in their philosophy, was to preserve and hone a soldier's capabilities, not grind them to the edge of collapse. They should be nurtured, Kel murmured. Not brutalized. They are nurtured, Harlow countered. But nurturing doesn't always look like kindness. Sometimes it's pushing someone so far they realize they're stronger than they ever believed. That's how leaders are born. Kel didn't respond. He was trying to process it all, the mud, the yelling, the endless running and crawling. Nothing about this resembled the training facilities of the Kisek. There, the harshest thing a cadet might endure was a failed simulation and a stern evaluation. Here, failure meant falling face first into the earth and being screamed at until you got back up. And yet, no one was quitting. That's what unsettled him most. The resilience, the relentless drive, the fact that these humans didn't just suffer, they chose to suffer, they welcomed it. It was part of their transformation. Commander Kel had come expecting to study a foreign military system. What he found instead was a wholly alien mentality. These people were not just preparing for war, they were preparing to become something else entirely. Something forged from sweat, pain, and unyielding will. As they reached the next stage of the tour, Kel paused for a moment, rain running down the ridges of his face. He looked back at the cadets, still crawling through muck, still shouting, still pushing forward. He felt something then that he hadn't expected. Dread. Dread. This was only the beginning of the tour. And already, he was afraid. Commander Kel hadn't stopped processing what he'd already seen: cadets trudging through sludge, screams echoing across soaked fields, instructors hurling commands with a ferocity that would be deemed abusive in Kazakh culture. But even as the shock lingered, Major Harlow pressed forward, his energy boundless, his pride in this chaos radiating through every word he spoke. This, the major said with a sweep of his arm, is just the surface. Let me show you what it really means to become a soldier here. Kel and his aide Varric followed, their boots squelching through wet grass. The sky remained gray, rain still falling in steady sheets, as if the weather itself was part of the curriculum. Ahead lay a towering obstacle course. Thick ropes hung from overhead beams, Walls loomed at impossible heights, and coils of barbed wire sneaked through the dirt. A murky trench gaped at the far end like the maw of a predator. Kel paused, trying to grasp the purpose of such a setup. "What is all this for?" he asked, his voice tinged with dread. Harlow grinned. "We call it the Crucible. It's the final test. No food, minimal sleep. It simulates the worst conditions a soldier might face and then pushes them harder." Kel blinked, confused and disturbed. "You? Deprive them? On purpose?" "Absolutely," Harlow said with no hesitation. "They go through it after weeks of grueling prep. It's not just about strength or speed. It's about breaking them down, stripping away every layer of comfort, and finding out who they really are." Varric nearly dropped his datapad. Even his twitching antennae seemed paralyzed by disbelief. "You intentionally push your own soldiers to the edge of collapse before they even face the enemy?" Kel asked. "Yes," Harlow answered without flinching. "Because we believe something powerful happens there at that breaking point. We don't just train people to fight. We train them to survive everything." Kel watched as cadets climbed ropes in the pouring rain, arms trembling, clothes drenched, faces covered in mud. No one stopped. No one asked for help. When someone fell, they got up every single time. The Keswick had always seen adversity as something to be minimized through technology and planning. Fatigue clouded judgment. Hunger impaired reaction time. Emotional strain increased errors. So why then? Were these humans wet, cold, exhausted, still functioning? More than functioning, they were thriving. A young cadet hauled herself over a wall, her face contorted in pain, but her eyes were locked with unwavering determination. Another crawled beneath barbed wire with blood on her elbow but a smile on her face. It wasn't bravado. It was something deeper, an internal fire, the kind of thing that didn't just survive adversity, it devoured it. "It's a ritual," Varric whispered, almost reverently. "You mold them through hardship." Harlow gave a short nod. "Exactly. Most people outside don't get it. They think we're cruel. But we're not doing this out of malice. We're doing it out of necessity." As they moved past the obstacle course, Kel tried to reconcile what he was witnessing. To Keswick minds, military excellence came from mental acuity, calculated risk-taking, and the precision of technology. But humans? They seemed to believe excellence came from pain. "Your cadets," Kel said slowly, "appear to embrace suffering, as if it's honorable." "Not honorable," Harlow corrected. "Essential. Adversity is the furnace that tempers the blade. We don't hide from discomfort. We hunt it down. Because we believe the more you've suffered in training, the more prepared you are in battle. Not just physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually even." "Spiritual condition?" Kel repeated. "Sure. Not religious necessarily, but there's a transformation that happens when you suffer with purpose. When you choose it, it redefines you." Kel was silent. The idea was so foreign to him that it bordered on absurd. In Keswick training, obstacles were precisely engineered, not intentionally chaotic. A soldier wasn't broken. They were sharpened, like a scalpel, not forged like a sword. "Why not avoid this?" he asked. "Why not train with simulation, with comfortable efficiency?" "Because war isn't comfortable," Harlow replied. "It's brutal, unfair, loud, terrifying, unpredictable. So we simulate that, not with screens and theory, but with chaos." They turned down a wooded trail, the sound of shouting replaced by the softer rustle of wind through the trees. Smoke curled into the air nearby, and a few figures were clustered around makeshift shelters. "What's this?" Kel asked warily. "Survival field training," Harlow explained. "They spend the night out here with nothing but a knife, a length of rope, and what they can scavenge." Kel stepped back, aghast. "You send them into the wilderness, with only a knife?" Harlow chuckled. "Nature is the harshest instructor there is. Cold, hunger, fatigue, It's all part of the test. They build fire, construct shelter, purify water. They learn to adapt. Adaptation should be left to machines, Varric muttered under his breath. That's where you and I differ, Harlow said. You rely on technology to keep your soldiers safe. We rely on training to make sure ours survive even when the technology fails. Because out there, in the middle of the fight, when everything goes to hell, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your training. So we make the floor as high as possible. That sentence lingered in Kel's mind, like a warning. They continued walking, stepping around muddy paths and logs where cadets were using knives to strip bark and build rudimentary traps. One young man was digging into the frozen ground with his bare hands, shivering but focused. He's building a fire pit, Harlow said proudly. No fire, no warmth, no warmth, no survival. Kel watched, stunned. You teach them to endure everything. Exactly, Harlow said. We push them beyond exhaustion, beyond doubt. We want them to look fear in the eye and keep moving. But what if they break? They do, Harlow said flatly. Some break, but most come out stronger. They learn that their limits aren't where they thought they were. They learn how much pain they can tolerate and still make rational decisions. They find out who they really are. Kel's mind raced. This wasn't just physical training. It was psychological transformation. The humans weren't merely teaching technique. They were remaking people. Every single element, Harlow said as they stopped to watch another cadet building shelter from branches and vines, is meant to challenge something inside. Some come here cocky, thinking strength is enough. They leave humble. Some come weak, unsure if they belong. They leave knowing they earned it. You don't just get through this by being fast or tough. You need something else. What? Kel asked quietly. Harlow turned, his voice serious now. Grit, resolve, that stubborn part of the soul that refuses to quit. Commander Kel didn't reply. For a moment, all he could hear was the crackle of a fresh fire catching, the hiss of rain on heated stone, and the rhythmic pounding of young warriors being molded by the elements. In Keswick culture, willpower was praised, but rarely tested like this. Their people avoided discomfort, designed everything to be calculated and controlled. Yet here were humans, choosing to suffer, turning struggle into a crucible, emerging from it stronger than before. Kel felt something churn in his stomach. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't even pity. It was awe. Rain still poured in relentless sheets, soaking everything it touched, but the storm no longer registered to Commander Kel. His outer garments were damp, his eyes wide and unblinking, and his stomach twisted in quiet protest at what he was witnessing. What he had already witnessed would have been enough to fill an entire Kazakh military review archive with red alerts. Cadets crawling through mud, going days without food or sleep, being pushed to the brink of collapse and then demanded to rise again. It was a miracle in his mind that any of them survived training at all. But Major Harlow, unfazed and perhaps even energized by the growing horror in his alien guest's eyes, kept leading him forward. Kel was beginning to understand something unsettling. To the humans, this wasn't the limit. It was only the beginning. They crossed a fence line into a wide open field lined with concrete barriers, scattered metal targets, and strange boxy devices embedded in the ground. In the distance, muffled booms echoed beneath the constant drone of rain. A plume of smoke curled upward, black against the gray sky. Kel instinctively ducked. "What exactly is this place?" he asked cautiously, eyes scanning the landscape for signs of danger. "This?" Harlow said with a grin. "This is our live fire training range." The words didn't register at first. "Live fire?" Kel repeated slowly. "Yep, real bullets, real explosives, real consequences." Kel stared at him in disbelief. "You train your cadets with actual weapons? How else would they learn?" Harlow replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Kel glanced across the field. A line of cadets, most of them no older than 20, were sprinting between barriers, rifles in hand, ducking and weaving as they took cover and fired at moving targets. Instructors moved alongside them, shouting orders, correcting mistakes, and occasionally dragging a cadet to start over if they missed a shot or hesitated under pressure. There was no pause button, no simulation, no safety net. In the Kazakh fleet, Kel said, his voice tight, live fire training is restricted to elite operatives. It's done under controlled environments with strict oversight and advanced safety measures. It is dangerous. So is war, Harlow replied flatly. Kel watched one cadet trip as he tried to vault over a barricade. Mud splashed, his weapon clattered. Before he could even blink, the instructor was in his face, barking commands. The cadet scrambled up, picked up his rifle, and ran the course again, faster this time. "They don't hesitate," Varric whispered, his voice shaking slightly. "They act as if the danger is normal." "That's the goal," Harlow said. "We train them to stay sharp under fire. If they panic here, they'll panic out there. We can't afford that." Another explosion thundered in the distance. Kel flinched again. This time, the blast came from a trench where several cadets were handling what looked like round metallic objects. Harlow turned and walked toward them with no concern. Kel followed, his feet moving before his brain could object. A cadet pulled the pin from a grenade, shouted a command, and lobbed it into the trench with practiced motion. A heartbeat later, a muffled blast rocked the ground. Kel's mouth hung open. "Are those live grenades?" he asked, horrified. "Sure are," Harlow said cheerfully. "You think we wait until combat to teach them how to handle one? But these are trainees. They could die, which is exactly why we teach them now," Harlow replied, his voice steady, eyes sharp, "so they don't die later. Mistakes happen, but better they happen here, where instructors can step in, than out in the real fight, where a wrong move means someone doesn't come home." The logic wasn't lost on Kel. In a cold, analytical sense, it was almost sound, but emotionally, morally, it was barbaric. Still, there was no denying that the cadets seemed capable, focused, fearless. No, not fearless. Fear was present. Kel could see it in their eyes, but they moved anyway. That was the terrifying part. "That kind of composure," Varric said, still scribbling frantically on his datapad, "it's unnatural." "No," Harlow said. "It's trained. We build it." Kel was starting to see what he meant. This wasn't just about learning to fire a weapon. It was about rewiring how the brain responded to chaos. About teaching the body to move even when instinct screamed to freeze. They moved on, passing bunkers where cadets were locked in close-quarters drills. Kel slowed as he watched two young men grapple violently on the concrete floor. There were no weapons, just fists, elbows, knees. It was ugly, raw, and unrelenting. An instructor circled them like a predator, watching every movement. One cadet was knocked flat, stunned. The instructor stepped in, slapped him on the shoulder, and said something. The boy blinked, rose to his feet, and went right back in. "This is sanctioned?" Kel asked, horrified. "It's necessary," Harlow answered. "You don't always get to fight from a distance. Sometimes the enemy is in your face. If you can't handle that, if you freeze or hesitate, you're dead. So we train for it." Kel had no words. The Kazakh didn't train for melee. That was the domain of ancient war stories, not modern battle. And yet here it was, happening in a corner of the human academy, like it was just another class in the schedule. They walked in silence for a while, the rain still tapping on their shoulders like cold fingers. Eventually, Harlow gestured toward a tall concrete structure with reinforced doors. Kel hesitated. "I've shown you how we train their bodies," Harlow said. "Now let's show you how we train their minds." Inside, The lighting dimmed, and the air felt heavy. Rows of strange pods lined the walls, each one humming with quiet energy. Cadets were strapped into them, eyes closed, muscles tensed. Monitors above the pods flickered with images of war, urban combat, forest ambushes, night raids. Through the walls, muffled voices could be heard, shouting, commands, screams. "What is this?" Kel asked cautiously. "Virtual combat training," Harlow replied. "But it's not like your simulations. These aren't passive strategy games. We replicate the chaos, the pain, the pressure, the uncertainty. Everything they'll face in a real fight." Kel peered through a viewing panel into one of the pods. The cadet inside was twitching, murmuring, eyes flickering beneath his lids. "They feel it?" Kel asked. "They feel everything," Harlow said. "Fear, exhaustion, confusion. We overwhelm their senses. It's not about comfort, it's about composure. If they can think clearly here, in the middle of hell, then they'll survive the real thing." Kel's legs felt weak. He took a step back. Varric had stopped writing. His eyes were glassy. "This is madness," Kel whispered. "No," Harlow replied, his tone quieter. "This is preparation." Kel looked at the cadets again, at their drawn faces, their clenched jaws, the resolve etched into every motion. He understood now, in a way that terrified him. These weren't just soldiers. They were survivors in the making. Warriors forged not only through pain, but through an intimacy with fear that the Kazekh had never dared allow. Harlow gestured to the hallway. "Come on, there's more to see." "No," Kel said softly. "We've seen enough." Harlow stopped. For a moment, he didn't smile. He didn't joke. His eyes just held the quiet, unshakable truth. "This is what makes us dangerous, Commander," he said. "Not our weapons, not our numbers. This, the training, the hardship, the grit. Our soldiers don't just survive war, they're shaped by it. And that's something no enemy has ever truly been ready for." Kel looked around one last time. The fire, the trenches, the bunkers, the screaming, the silence. He understood now. He didn't just fear the humans because of what they could do. He feared them because of what they were willing to endure. The sky had not changed. The rain still fell in gray sheets. The wind still sliced through the air like a blade, and the shouting of cadets still echoed across the training fields. But something inside Commander Kel had shifted. He'd come here expecting a tactical exchange, charts, simulations, perhaps a polite review of doctrine and strategy. Instead, he had seen soldiers made in mud, fire, and sheer force of will. He had seen pain used not as punishment, but as pedagogy. He had seen things that shook the foundation of everything he knew about military strength. And yet somehow, Major Harlow still wasn't done. "There's one last stop," Harlow said, gesturing toward a low, unassuming structure near the edge of the academy grounds. "This part isn't flashy, but it might be the most important." Kel followed silently, Varric trailing behind, pale and visibly rattled. The young aide had stopped scribbling notes. He no longer had questions, only wide eyes and a trembling jaw. The building was nondescript, just steel walls, reinforced doors, and a keypad entry. Harlow punched in a code, and the door slid open with a hiss. Inside was a narrow hallway, dimly lit and lined with heavy doors. The air felt heavier here, thicker, quieter. It smelled faintly of ozone and sweat. "What is this place?" Kel asked cautiously. "The stress testing chamber," Harlow replied. Even the name sounded ominous. At the end of the hallway, Harlow opened one of the doors and stepped aside. Kel peered inside. The room was sparse. A single chair sat in the center, surrounded by an array of monitors. Cables ran along the floor. A young cadet stood at attention beside the chair, barely older than a juvenile Keswick, but his face bore the telltale signs of exhaustion. dark circles under his eyes, hands that trembled ever so slightly, a posture that was rigid but fraying at the edges. "This," Harlow said, "is where we push their minds as far as their bodies have already gone. Maybe further." Kell frowned. "What do you mean push? In what way?" Harlow nodded to the cadet. "Commence level 6 scenario." Without hesitation, the cadet strapped himself into the chair. The lights dimmed, and the monitors blinked to life. Images flickered across the screens: battlefields, explosions, incoming transmissions, casualties, weapons fire, and data readouts all competing for attention. Alarms blared. Red lights flashed. Kell took a step closer, watching as the cadet's hands flew across a console, issuing commands, adjusting strategy, reallocating forces, responding to half a dozen emergencies at once. "This scenario," Harlow explained, "is designed to overwhelm every sense. We simulate a battlefield where everything that can go wrong does go wrong. No help, no rest, just decisions, constant, high-stakes decisions." Cal didn't speak. He was watching too closely now, his instincts engaged. The cadet's breathing was fast. His jaw was clenched. Sweat glistened on his brow. One screen showed a surprise enemy flank. Another displayed a wounded ally begging for evac. A third pulsed with system failures, comms down, radar jammed, supplies cut off. "The goal here," Harlow continued, "isn't just performance. It's mental resilience. We want to know what they do when panic should take over. When it's easier to shut down. Do they lead? Do they freeze? Do they endure?" Kell felt a tightness in his chest. This is cruel." "No," Harlow said softly. "This is preparation. War doesn't come when you're well rested and thinking clearly. It hits when you're exhausted, afraid, and unsure. If they can lead here, they can lead anywhere." The scenario intensified. Enemy forces closed in. Friendly units were breaking. Critical decisions had to be made: sacrifice one unit to save another? Risk an airstrike near civilians? Wait too long and everyone dies. The cadet's face twisted under pressure, but he didn't stop. He barked orders, moved resources, made hard calls without hesitation. Kell realized he was holding his breath. The simulation finally ended with a sharp tone. The monitors went dark. The cadet slumped in the chair, breathing heavily, his hands limp at his sides. Harlow stepped forward and placed a hand on the cadet's shoulder. "You lasted longer this time. Good work." The cadet nodded weakly, but there was something in his eyes: resolve, not pride, not confidence. Just the quiet, grim knowledge that he had faced the storm and didn't break. Harlow turned to Kell and Varric, guiding them back into the hallway. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Kell felt numb. "Why do you do this?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry, just wearied. Like something in him had started to unravel. Why push them this far? Why break them again and again? Harlow didn't answer right away. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes distant. "Because war doesn't wait for them to be ready," he said at last. "It doesn't care if they're tired or scared or overwhelmed. War strikes when your hands are shaking and your team's looking to you for answers. So we teach them to lead through that. We teach them to command through chaos." Cal looked away. He didn't want to believe it. He wanted to argue. But the logic was airtight, and it was terrifying. In the Kazakh military, training focused on intellect, composure, and efficiency. Stress was managed, not inflicted. Chaos was mitigated, not simulated. They prepared their officers to make perfect decisions in perfect conditions. But humans? They prepared for the worst conditions imaginable and then made them worse. And somehow, through that crucible, they emerged sharper, harder, unbreakable. Harlan opened the exit door and the wind hit them again. Rain drizzled down from above, cold and unrelenting. In the distance, cadets were still running, still climbing, still pushing. Your people, Kel began, struggling for the words. They don't just train to survive. No, Harlow said. We train to endure, to adapt, to win. No matter what. Kel swallowed hard. The truth sat heavy in his throat. The weapons, the tactics, the gear, it all mattered. But this was what made humans dangerous. They didn't wait for the perfect plan or the perfect moment. They charged through the fire, bloodied and broken, and came out the other side stronger. They turned pain into discipline, chaos into clarity, fear into fire. And worst of all, they didn't see it as cruelty. They saw it as necessary. Kel looked at Varric, whose antennae drooped, his face pale and unreadable. There was no need to debrief. They both knew what this meant. Prepare our departure, Kel said quietly. Varric gave a shaky nod and began tapping on his device. Kel turned back to Major Harlow, and despite everything he felt revulsion, disbelief, and yes, fear, there was also a flicker of respect. You've shown me more than I expected, he said. More than I was prepared to understand. And now, I see why humans are feared on the battlefield. Harlow didn't smile. Not this time. Fear isn't our goal, he said calmly. It's just a byproduct of what we're willing to do to protect what we love. Kel offered a short nod. He couldn't argue. He didn't want to argue. As they reached the shuttle bay, Kel looked back one last time. The academy was still there, massive, Spartan, relentless. The place where boys and girls became something else entirely. The wind howled, the rain poured, but no one had stopped. The cadets kept moving, kept training, kept becoming. The image seared into his mind. A forge, not of fire, but of rain, dirt, pressure, and pain. The shuttle lifted off with a quiet hum. Earth fell away beneath them. And for the first time in his long decorated career, Commander Kel felt fear not of the battlefield, not of weapons or tactics, but of willpower. Humans had learned to weaponize it, and the galaxy would never be the same. Commander Kel stood just outside the shuttle bay, rainwater running in rivulets down his uniform, pooling at the edges of his boots. Behind him, the human military academy roared with relentless life. Mud, shouting, fire drills, simulated battles, it was all still happening, as if no time had passed at all. But for Kel, everything had changed. He had seen enough. Yet even now, Major Harlow stood beside him with that same calm intensity, seemingly unfazed by the downpour or the alien's haunted expression. You understand now, don't you? Harlow said quietly, no longer wearing the grin he'd sported for most of the tour. Kel didn't answer right away. His gaze swept across the field. Cadets were sprinting through drills, soaked to the bone, breath steaming in the cold air. They weren't slowing down. They weren't complaining. They didn't even seem to notice the misery. It was more than endurance. It was acceptance. I came here to learn, Kel finally said, voice low. To observe your tactics, your philosophy of war. I thought I would see training exercises and strategy briefings. What I saw instead was, he paused, a crucible. Harlow gave a slow nod. That's what this place is. Kel turned to face him fully. You don't just prepare your soldiers to fight battles. You prepare them to survive the worst possible version of every battle, to suffer, to adapt, to continue despite everything that would break most beings. Harlow studied him. That's the difference between survival and dominance. Kel exhaled slowly, as if releasing the last of his assumptions. You strip away every comfort, every sense of safety. You grind them down until all that remains is the core, and then you train that. Exactly, Harlow said. Because war doesn't reward comfort, it punishes it. We build warriors who don't just survive contact with the enemy. We build warriors who thrive in. Kel's eyes narrowed slightly. We have superior technology, superior strategy. Our simulations are exact. Our battlefield logic has been refined over centuries. And still, Harlow said, your simulations can't prepare you for a moment when everything goes wrong. When your comms fail, when your men are screaming, when you're surrounded, when you're scared. Kel didn't respond. He didn't have to, because it was true. And now he knew it. What you've built here, he said quietly, isn't just a military force. It's a mindset. You've weaponized adversity. Harlow smiled again, but this time there was no pride in it, just quiet affirmation. That's what makes us dangerous, Commander. It's not the weapons, not the tactics. It's that when the world crumbles, we don't. Kel stood silent for a long moment, the wind and rain lashing against him as he stared into the heart of the academy. He thought of the cadets in the mud, crawling through barbed wire with bleeding elbows and gritted teeth. He thought of the survival camps, the live grenades, the stress chambers that simulated the chaos of war so perfectly it made his pulse spike just watching. He thought of those screaming simulation pods where young men and women lived out death over and over again until fear became something they could hold in their hands and use. And he realized something that chilled him to the bone. These humans did not avoid pain. They mastered it. They didn't fear chaos. They trained in it. They didn't fight despite their suffering. They fought through it. And that was a kind of strength Kel had never even imagined. Varric approached from the shuttle ramp, soaked, silent, eyes wide with the same quiet terror Kel felt in his bones. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod to indicate the shuttle was ready. Kel looked back at Harlow one last time. You've given me much to think about, Major. More than I expected, more than I wanted. Harlow nodded. Most of the off-world commanders who tour this place say the same. Then they go home. They bring their reports, their data. But what they really bring back is this feeling you have right now, the knowledge that there's something out there they didn't plan for, something they didn't account for in their war games and projections. And what's that? Kel asked, though part of him already knew. Harlow's gaze was unflinching. The human spirit. Kel flinched, not because of the words, but because of how true they felt. The battlefield doesn't scare us, Commander, Harlow continued. We live on a death world. Everything here is trying to kill us. The environment, the predators, our own mistakes, and somehow we're still here, still fighting, still adapting. He gestured broadly to the cadets still running laps through the downpour, their uniforms soaked, their faces hardened. This is how we survive. This is how we win. Not by waiting for the perfect moment, but by refusing to quit in the worst one. Kel's throat felt dry despite the rain. We will take this back to the High Council, he said. They need to understand what we're facing. Good, Harlow replied. Because most don't. They think strength is about power output and fleet size. They think endurance is about fuel reserves. But humans? We train our minds to go further than our bodies, our hearts to last longer than our rations. And when all else fails, when the tech is gone, when the strategy collapses, when the odds are impossible, we don't stop. We don't stop. Kel nodded once. It was all he could manage. Then he turned, walking up the shuttle ramp, every footstep feeling heavier than the last. As the doors hissed closed behind him and the engines warmed for takeoff, he sat in his command seat and looked back one last time. The human academy was fading into the mist, its walls shadowed and cold. But Kel knew what lay behind them, now young warriors forged not in luxury, but in hardship, in relentless pressure, in truth, the truth of who they really were. Not soldiers, not machines, but something more dangerous than both. Believers. Believers in the power of struggle, in the strength hidden behind pain, in the weapon forged from suffering. and the galaxy his people had underestimated that. As the shuttle broke atmosphere, Varric finally spoke. "What do we tell the Council, Commander?" Kel didn't answer right away. Then softly he said, "Tell them the humans are ready for war, in a way we've never seen before." Varric paused. "And what about us?" Kel looked out the viewport, his thoughts dark and heavy. "I'm not sure we are." They fell into silence as the stars stretched out before them. But Kel knew this silence wouldn't last. The report he would deliver would send ripples through every chamber of the Kizek High Command. The war analysts would balk. The philosophers would debate ethics. The generals would question the madness of human methods. But none of that would change the truth. Humans weren't stronger. They were hardened. And there's a difference. The kind of difference that decides wars. The shuttle's cabin was silent, except for the hum of the engines and the occasional beep from the navigation console. Commander Kel sat near the viewport, staring out at the receding Earth below. The planet looked peaceful from up here, calm, beautiful, untouched by the horrors he'd witnessed on its surface. But Kel knew better. That world below was anything but soft. It was a forge. A place that bred something utterly alien to him, something more terrifying than any weapon he'd ever faced. Human resolve. Varric sat across from him, eyes downcast, tapping notes into his datapad without enthusiasm. The young aide had run out of words long ago. His antennae barely moved now. He, too, had seen what they came to see. And like Kel, he was still trying to make sense of it. Kel shifted in his seat. His body was dry now, but he could still feel the cold sting of rain, the sharp bark of instructors, the pressure of everything he'd witnessed in that academy. He could still hear it. They don't just prepare their soldiers to fight. They prepare them to break and then keep going. Kel didn't know if it was brilliance or madness, but it had worked. The humans had developed a system that transcended tactics. They hadn't just optimized their forces, they'd transformed them, not with tech or simulations or elite genetics, but with something older, something primal, something primal. They trained the human spirit, and somehow, in that relentless, miserable training ground filled with yelling, pain, mud, and live explosives, that spirit didn't fade, it sharpened. He could see it now in his mind. The cadet who face-planted in the mud and got up without hesitation. The one who was trembling with exhaustion, yet held command through a simulated crisis. The boy who dug a fire pit with his bare hands just to survive the night. None of them quit. Not one. The shuttle's AI chimed, notifying them of their trajectory toward the fleet's orbiting station. Still, Kel couldn't look away from Earth. He wasn't sure he ever would. Varric cleared his throat hesitantly. "Commander, what do we do with this knowledge?" Kel didn't answer right away. He was too busy reviewing everything they'd seen, not as separate events, but as one continuous revelation. The Human Academy had been brutal. Undeniably so. Their training methods would never be permitted in the Kizek fleet. Too chaotic, too risky, too inhumane. And yet, what it produced, what emerged from that suffering, was something far more resilient than anything Kizek training could hope to yield. Not just soldiers, not just professionals. Warriors. People who didn't flinch when pain struck, who didn't wait for rescue when things fell apart. People who ran toward fire instead of away from it. "Commander?" Varric pressed again, softer this time. Kel finally spoke. "We rewrite the way we think about strengths." Varric blinked. "Sir?" Kel turned from the window. His voice was tired but steady. "All our doctrine, all our simulations, our protocols, our efficiency models, they're missing something. A core component. We prepare our minds, our weapons, our tactics. But we've ignored the soul." "The soul?" Varric asked, clearly confused. "Yes," Kel said. "That internal grit. That drive to keep going even when logic says to stop. The humans train it like it's muscle. They beat it into their soldiers until it becomes instinct. Varric nodded slowly, processing. We've built perfect systems, Kel continued, but they've built imperfect people capable of facing anything. Systems break. People like that, they don't. There was a long pause as the shuttle soared silently through the void. Finally, Varric asked the question that had been weighing on them both since the tour began. Do you believe we underestimated? Kel looked back at Earth. The clouds parted over a continent. A storm swept across an ocean. Somewhere down there, cadets were still training, still being pushed, still being hardened. No, Kel said. We misunderstood them. And that, he realized, was far worse. By the time they reached the fleet, Kel had rewritten his entire report. The technical assessments were there, of course, notes on human weaponry, reaction times, coordination under fire. But none of that mattered as much as what he wrote at the end. The strength of the human military does not come from their tools. It comes from their refusal to surrender, not just in combat, but in training, in mentality, in identity. They have learned to turn struggle into strength, and that makes them the most dangerous adversary we have ever encountered. He added a final warning. Do not engage them without understanding this. You will not break them. You will only teach them how to fight harder. When the council received his findings, they were skeptical at first. Some even laughed, but others read the last few pages in silence, their brows furrowing, their expressions darkening. They understood. It wasn't the size of humanity's fleet that mattered, or the power of their rifles. It was the mindset behind the trigger. Back aboard the command vessel, Kel took one last moment for himself. He stared at the Earth again through the observation deck's massive glass panel. He found himself thinking not like a soldier, but like a being trying to understand something deeper. What made humans choose pain? What made them step into the storm willingly, knowing they could be broken? And then he realized it wasn't because they loved suffering. It was because they believed in transformation. Because deep down, humans understood something universal, something ancient. Hardship is the price of becoming. They didn't run from the fire. They stepped into it again and again because they believed the version of themselves on the other side would be worth it. And somehow, in all their chaos and brutality, they were right. A lesson for all worlds. As Kel filed his final notes, he couldn't help but reflect on his own people, on their fear of discomfort, their obsession with perfection, their insistence on control. And he wondered, had they traded greatness for comfort, precision for growth, predictability for real strength? Humans, in all their flawed glory, had reminded him of something his species had long forgotten. You don't become strong by avoiding pain. You become strong by walking through it and choosing to keep going. And perhaps that lesson wasn't just for soldiers. It was for leaders, for parents, for civilizations, for anyone who's ever faced something that seemed too hard, too heavy, too hopeless. Maybe the human way, the path through suffering, the obsession with growth, the will to adapt wasn't madness after all. Maybe it was truth. And if so, maybe the rest of the galaxy had something to learn from Earth, not about how to fight, but about how to endure.